I can't raise a sick child. I'm leaving." My daughter Clara said this while holding her suitcase, looking at her newborn son with a congenital heart defect. She walked out of our home and didn't look back. The baby, Elias, had breathing crises constantly. His skin was so pale it looked like glass. The doctors were clear. Without surgery, without constant care, he wouldn't survive childhood. I was 48 years old. I had no steady job. I cleaned houses for a living, but I looked at that tiny baby, my grandson, and knew I wouldn't abandon him like his mother did. For 26 years, I raised him alone. We slept at train stations when we had no home. We ate from dumpsters when we had no money. We walked hours to hospitals when we couldn't afford the bus. But Elias survived. More than that, he flourished. At 15, he built his first app. At 20, he sold it for millions. At 26, he founded a tech company and built me a White House with a garden. Then one morning, the doorbell rang. It was Clara. After 26 years, she looked at our mansion in shock, asked to see her son. Elias opened the door, looked at her and said, "You're not my mother." "She is," and closed the door. Let me tell you the full story of those 26 years. I never thought my own daughter would be capable of something like this. I was convinced that no matter what mistakes she made in life, she would never cross that line. But she did. She did it without looking back. Clara was my only child. I had her young, at just 18 years old, when the world still seemed uncertain to me, but full of possibilities. I raised her alone after her father left us. Despite all the difficulties, she never lacked food, clean clothes, or a warm bed. I gave up a lot for her and believed that one day she would appreciate it. But Clara grew up with a strength and coldness that I found hard to understand. She never lacked love, but character. She was a proud, restless girl who became more and more distant over the years. At 20, she left the house with a man she barely knew. I was against it, but I couldn't stop her. She said she had to live her own life, make her own decisions, be free. I watched her go without suspecting that this was only the beginning of something much more painful. Months passed without hearing from her. Then one night she called crying and said she was pregnant. The child's father wanted nothing to do with it, and she couldn't go on. She came home with an already swollen belly, pale and thin like a shadow of herself. I opened the door, as any mother would have done. I asked no questions, made her food, and helped her lie down. For a while, it seemed like everything could be okay. I thought motherhood would awaken something in her, but it didn't. When the child was born, everything changed. Clara barely touched the boy. I held him all day, fed him, changed his diapers, calmed him when he cried. She said she couldn't do it. She was exhausted. The baby was taking her breath away. She looked at him as if he were an unbearable burden. I, on the other hand, loved him from the first moment. He had big eyes like Clara as a child, and a weak, halting breathing, as if the world were too heavy for his lungs. The doctors told us he had a congenital heart defect. He needed constant care, regular examinations, medications, and perhaps surgery later. Clara fell silent. That night she didn't come home. The next day she called from the bus station. She said she couldn't handle it. She was leaving with a man who had come back for her. She couldn't spend her life raising a sick child. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She just said goodbye. The baby's crying was the only thing I heard for hours after hanging up. There was no one but him and me. I held him with trembling arms and knew, without thinking, that this child would not die, that I would not leave him to anyone, that I would not abandon him as his mother had done. I gave him a name myself. I called him Elias. In that moment, he was born to me, not as a grandson, but as a son. The hardest days of my life began. I had no steady job. I did hourly cleaning jobs in some houses, took care of an elderly lady in the afternoons, washed other people's laundry when I could. With a sick baby, everything became slower, harder. Elias slept poorly. He had constant breathing crises. His skin was so pale it looked like glass. I learned to understand his cries as if they were words. I knew when he wanted my breast, even though I had no milk, when he just sought warmth, when the pain was tearing him apart inside. Every hospital visit was a world unto itself. People who looked at us with pity. Doctors who spoke in cold technical terms. Nurses who sometimes had compassion and sometimes just wanted us not to disturb too much. They often asked where the mother was. I said she couldn't come. I lied. I did it to protect Clara, even though she didn't deserve it. I wanted my grandson to grow up without resentment, that he at least wouldn't know for a while that he had been left behind like a burden by his own flesh and blood. There were days when I didn't eat so he could have his formula. Days when I washed diapers in a basin and hung clothes in the rain. Days when I prayed, without knowing to whom, that he wouldn't die in my arms. My legs trembled with exhaustion, but I never left him alone. I carried him everywhere wrapped in old blankets, his little body pressed to my chest. His heartbeat was irregular, but it was there. That was the sign that he was still with me. That was all that mattered. Little by little, I learned to organize the time between work and his treatments. Life became a survival routine. He grew slowly, but he held on. I became harder without wanting to. I no longer cried, I acted. My home was a small room with damp walls and a low ceiling. But within those walls grew a love that demanded nothing. When he finally began to smile, I knew it had been worth it. The hardest thing was having no one, no family, no support. Some neighbors gave me used clothes. One woman brought me bread when she could. But the rest of the world kept turning without seeing us. We were invisible. A sick child and an older woman carrying him as if it were her last duty on earth. Many told me I should hand him over to an institution. It was too much for me. I couldn't do it alone. I never listened. Somehow we survived. Every night he slept without fever was a victory. Every day without a crisis, a gift. When he turned 3 years old, he spoke his first word. He called me Mama. I told him I was his grandmother. But he repeated it with his weak but determined voice again and again. Then I understood that titles didn't matter. He saw in me the one who had truly given him life. From then on, nothing could stop me. Raising a sick child alone is not something you choose. You take it on. There's no time for drama or complaints. You don't cry when a little body depends on you to breathe. After Clara left, I no longer thought of her as someone who would return. I erased her from my plans, from my prayers. I only thought about Elias. Every minute of the day revolved around his well-being. Illnesses didn't wait, gave no breaks, and I couldn't pause either. At 4 years old, Elias was still too small for his age. His skin was thin, his heart too fragile, but his mind was sharp. He learned quickly. I read him bedtime stories even when my eyes were swollen from fatigue. He memorized the stories, pointed at words, asked about their meanings. He never asked about his mother. It was as if in his world there was only him and me, and that was enough for him. I didn't talk about her either, not out of hatred, but out of protection. At that age, understanding abandonment can break a child's soul more than any illness. My days were the same. I got up before dawn, prepared breakfast with what little we had, and wrapped him warmly to take him with me when I couldn't leave him alone. I worked as a cleaning lady, washed other people's laundry, took care of children who weren't mine, while my own child sat quietly in a corner, drawing on recycled paper or playing with a broken doll someone had given us. He had no expensive toys, no new clothes, but he had my time, my arms, my eyes watching him every second. I gave him everything I could and even what I couldn't. There were moments when I thought I wouldn't make it. Once the hospital called and warned that without the medications he could deteriorate quickly. I had no money. I sold a small radio I used for the news and walked 2 hours to the pharmacy. I did it because the thought that his health depended on a few bills was unbearable to me. We lived in a damp house without hot water, with a leaky roof, but he was alive. And as long as he was alive, everything else was secondary. Not everything was pain. There were also tender moments that no one saw. When he fell asleep on my lap, his head pressed to my chest. When he said I smelled like home. When he brought me a dried flower from the street and said it was to make my day beautiful. These little gestures kept me upright, gave me strength when my body wanted to give up. Because although I was alone, I felt accompanied by a gaze that demanded nothing but deserved everything. We began to find our own rhythm of life, no luxuries but routines. Songs I sang to him before bed, soups I cooked when he was weak, games we invented with buttons and lids. Everything I didn't have with my daughter, I now experienced with Elias. Not because he replaced her, but because he showed me what true love is. The kind that needs no explanations, sets no conditions. That's simply there. When he turned 5 years old, his health was still fragile. The doctors were clear. Without surgery before his 7th birthday, the consequences could be irreversible. The public health system offered no solutions, only waiting lists, paperwork, empty promises. So I sought help elsewhere. There was a foundation that operated on children with heart diseases. Without shame, I knocked on their door with his story in hand. They listened to me, had me fill out forms, bring proof. One day they called. The surgery was scheduled for the fall. I cried silently when I hung up, not from fear, from relief. For the first time in years, I felt that something could change. I began to prepare Elias. I explained to him that they would make his heart stronger. He looked at me with the seriousness his eyes always had, as if he understood more than I said. He said he didn't want to leave me alone in the hospital. I promised to be with him the whole time. The day of the surgery came with light rain. I hugged him tight before he went into the operating room. I held his hand until the doctors asked me to leave. I prayed silently, without names or saints. I only asked that they not take him from me. I waited for hours on a hard chair, without eating, without moving. When the surgeon came out and said everything had gone well, I felt like I was going to faint. Not from weakness, from gratitude. Elias was in the hospital for 2 weeks. I visited him every day, brought him drawings, crossword puzzles, little notes I wrote so he wouldn't feel alone. When he came home, he was different. His skin had more color, he walked stronger, smiled more often. I was different too. My back hurt less. I had less fear. The worst was over, or at least I wanted to believe that. The following years were not easy, but more bearable. With the help of a social program and the support of the foundation, Elias got funding for a small private school that accommodated his medical needs. He went with his backpack on his back, proud, as if he were wearing a crown. Sometimes he said he wanted to be a doctor to help other children like him. Other times he said he wanted to build houses for single grandmothers. I just listened. I didn't want to impose dreams on him. I had lived enough to know that everyone must choose their own. We heard nothing from Clara. I didn't look for her, didn't mention her name. For me, she had become a formless shadow. I focused on looking forward. Every success of Elias was another stone in the invisible house we were building together. I grew older, yes, but with the dignity of a woman who knows she's doing the right thing. Every gray strand, every wrinkle was proof of my love. I needed nothing more. In the neighborhood, everyone knew him. They said he was polite, greeted everyone, helped the little ones. I walked with him arm in arm, and although I looked like his great-grandmother, no one dared to judge us. They knew what we had been through. Some admired us silently. Some asked how I always stayed strong. I smiled, not because I was strong, but because I couldn't afford to break. Elias grew, his body became stronger, and I began, without wanting to imagine a future. One in which he could be free and happy, in which he no longer had to carry the burden of a childhood marked by illness and abandonment. One in which, perhaps, for the first time, he could breathe without fear. That was all that mattered. Elias began school at 6 years old, somewhat later than the others. The doctors had advised waiting until his body could better handle the long school days. I didn't object. I knew he was different, not out of inability, but because of everything he had already been through in his short life. While other children were learning to read in the classroom, Elias could already do it at home, because I had taught him with books we got at flea markets, in thrift stores, or as gifts. On the first day of school, I dressed him in a borrowed shirt, patched pants and shoes that just barely fit him. He was happy, nervous, but his eyes were shining. He walked holding my hand and looked at me as if entering a palace. I, on the other hand, had a knot in my stomach. I was afraid that his heart wouldn't withstand the excitement, afraid that they would make fun of him, afraid that he would fall in the playground and not be able to get up. Fear was no longer a thought. It was a constant companion. It slept beside me, constantly whispered in my ear. Elias was different. He didn't run like the others, didn't shout, didn't push. He sat at his desk like a little adult, listened attentively, only raised his hand when asked, but learned faster than all the others. The teachers noticed this within the first month. They called me to tell me. They said he had an incredible ability to understand what he learned, an extraordinary memory. I heard it with a mixture of pride and fear. I didn't want him to stand out, neither positively nor negatively. I just wanted him to be a normal child, but you can't hide a radiant being. He was special, not because I raised him, not because he was sick, but because of the way he saw the world. He had a sensitivity that few children develop. He noticed when someone was sad. He shared his food even when there was little. He asked his teachers if they were tired. When a classmate fell, he was the first to help. He never returned an insult, never raised his voice. His way of being in the world touched me deeply. I continued to work as much as I could. I cleaned in 3 households per week. One woman let me live in a small room behind her house. In exchange, I cooked and ironed for her. From there, I went every afternoon to the school to pick up Elias. It was a long walk, but that didn't matter. On the way home, we talked. He told me what he had learned, asked about things I couldn't explain. Why were some people mean? Why did some children have no parents? Why did some have everything and others nothing? I didn't always answer. I listened. I didn't want to lie to him, but I also didn't have the strength to invent answers. At 7 years old, he had a relapse. It came suddenly. One night he woke up with shortness of breath. I took him to the hospital immediately. The doctors said it was a complication of his underlying condition. He had to stay in the hospital. For 5 days I slept on a plastic chair. I didn't leave for a moment. Every time he opened his eyes, he looked for me. I squeezed his hand and said everything was fine, even though I was breaking inside. That week I didn't work. Ate only what they gave me at the hospital. I lost one of my few jobs, but I didn't care. Elias recovered slowly, as always. But when we were discharged, we no longer had a home. The landlady had replaced me. She didn't care that I had a sick child. For the first time in months, I cried sitting on the sidewalk, without a sound, with clenched teeth, while Elias slept on my lap. That night we slept on a bench at the train station. I wrapped him in my blanket, told him a made-up story, and sang until he fell asleep. No one came closer, no one asked anything. It was just another night in a city that looks away. The next morning I sought out an older woman I knew from the time when I sold pastries. I asked her to let us stay in her yard for a few days. She allowed me to build a shelter from wood and tarps. We lived there for almost a year. Elias never complained. He played with stones, invented stories, helped me wash clothes. He never blamed me for anything, never demanded anything I couldn't give him. His mere presence reminded me that it was worth continuing. If I fell, he would fall too, so I stayed strong, even when I was broken inside. His doctor visits didn't stop. Once a month I took him for a checkup. Sometimes I didn't even have money for the bus and we walked for hours in the sun. When we arrived at the hospital, he was exhausted, but said nothing. He let himself be examined, let himself be pricked, answered the doctors politely. Everyone knew him. They called him the child who never complains. He, on the other hand, swallowed my anger because I saw how the years passed and no one really helped us. They gave us just enough to survive, but not to live. We celebrated his 8th birthday with a cake made from borrowed flour and an old candle. He blew hard. He said his wish was that I never get sick. I smiled and lied, said grandmothers like me don't get sick. But that night everything hurt. My bones, my back, my legs. I slept sitting up because I couldn't lie down. I woke up with numb fingers. I looked at myself in a broken mirror and didn't recognize myself. But I went to work, cleaned in houses where no one asked how I was doing, only that the floor shone. We were poor, very poor. But he never lacked food. He never slept without a blanket. I never left him alone. That was my only certainty. I couldn't promise him a future, but I could promise him not to abandon him like his mother did. And that promise kept me alive, because it was all I had. Despite everything, Elias began to stand out in school. The teachers wanted him to participate in competitions. I did everything to get him papers, pencils, books. I collected what others threw away. Sometimes people left used materials at our door without a word. I clung to these crumbs as if they were gold. Everything that came into his hands he made useful. It was as if he knew he couldn't waste anything. Not a second. Not a sheet of paper. I aged quickly, faster than I wanted. My body reminded me of it. But every time I was at my limit, Elias did something. A drawing, a sentence, a loving gesture. And the pain disappeared. It was enough for him to say Grandma to remind me why I lived, why it was worth continuing. No one looked for us. No one asked about him. His mother never called again. I no longer thought about her. I had learned not to hold grudges, but also not to wait for her. I had him, He had me, and that was enough for me. The challenges didn't disappear. They just changed form. It was no longer the feverish nights that kept me awake, but the comments at school, the looks from the parents, the teasing from other children when he couldn't run or was exhausted climbing stairs. His heart, although operated on, remained sensitive. There were limits he couldn't exceed. He knew it. The others didn't. He learned to hide his fatigue, to pretend everything was fine, to sit down when he couldn't go on anymore, without saying a word. He told me about it later when we went home. I listened in silence. Inside, my blood was boiling. I wanted to scream at everyone, but he asked me not to do anything. He didn't want attention, preferred to be invisible rather than arouse pity. That hurt more than any attack. At 9 years old, he excelled in mathematics and science. His teacher stopped me one afternoon and said she had never seen such an attentive, mentally agile, and mature child. She told me about an entrance exam for an elite school that could accept him with a scholarship if he passed. I thanked her, although inside I felt a pang. I knew I couldn't pay for preparatory courses, books, nothing. That night, Elias said he wanted to try. He didn't care if he failed. He just wanted to know how far he could go. I looked for used books, asked a retired teacher from the neighborhood for help, cooked the same thing for 3 days to buy him copies. He studied late with a small flashlight that a nurse had given him years ago. Every page he read was one more step into a hope I barely dared to have. I registered him with expired documents. My hands trembled as I signed the form. On exam day, I accompanied him to the entrance of the building. He wore the best shirt I could find. His hair was carefully combed, his eyes calm as always. He kissed me on the cheek and said everything would be fine. I stayed outside, sat on a bench, and watched the other parents. The children with new backpacks, shiny shoes, cell phones in hand. I felt small, but also proud, because none of them knew what he had been through to stand there. 2 weeks passed without news. I didn't ask, neither did he, until one day I came home from work and saw him with a letter in his hand. His eyes were moist, but he was smiling. He had passed. They gave him a full scholarship, including materials and medical care at the school. My legs became weak. I sat on the floor and cried like I hadn't in years. From relief, from joy, from justice. At 10 years old, he started at the new school. Every morning I took him to the bus stop. Every afternoon I waited for him there. At first I feared he might not belong, but he told me enthusiastically about his teachers, new friends, his joy. I listened to every word like a gift. For the first time, he felt part of something. The problems didn't disappear. Sometimes he had relapses, had to stay home for days, but we knew how to deal with it. He knew his limits, but challenged them wisely. He didn't overexert his body, but never let himself be treated as an invalid. He made himself known through his knowledge and his character. I learned from him every day. I learned not to complain, to look forward, to keep hope even when everything seemed dark. In the neighborhood, little changed. Poverty and insecurity remained. I worked where I could, cleaned, cooked, cared for elderly people. Sometimes days passed without me sitting down. My bones cracked, my hands were cracked, my eyesight was deteriorating. But I said nothing. It was enough to see him come home with good grades, praise from teachers, and new ideas. Even if we only ate rice or bread dunked in tea, we called it dinner and made it together. He set the table, I cooked, he washed dishes, I swept. We lived in harmony, without set roles, only with cooperation, love, and respect. It was our imperfect but dignified world. He began winning school competitions. Certificates, books, sometimes a little money. We saved everything for his future. We dreamed quietly. We didn't talk about what was missing, but about what was to come. He said he would one day buy me a house without a leaky roof. I replied that his joy already gave me the world. On Sundays, we went to the flea market for used books. He chose one, I chose one. We spent hours reading. We had no television, no internet, no luxury. But knowledge. He absorbed every page like nourishment, asked me to explain difficult words, wrote summaries, found stories, logic games. He was a radiant child. I just tried not to stand in the way of his growth. Sometimes I paused and looked at him without him noticing, and thought about Clara. How could she leave? What had she missed? Not out of hatred, out of wonder. I didn't understand how anyone could leave such a child behind. A child who, even in poverty and illness, made the world meaningful. He never asked about her, as if he knew from the beginning that his place was with me, as if he needed no other answers than those life gave him. I respected his silence. I didn't want to cloud his vision with the truth. Not yet. All that mattered was that he was moving forward, every day a little further from pain, closer to the future he deserved. No one looked for us. Elias's adolescence didn't come with rebellion or contempt. It came with silence and responsibility. At 12, he spoke like an adult, reserved, attentive, always watchful. He never contradicted me, never shut himself away, never blamed me for anything. He seemed to carry the burden of his story without bitterness, with an acceptance that hurt and filled me with pride at the same time. His health stabilized for a while. The checkups were good. The doctors looked at him admiringly, like a survivor, but we knew his body wasn't like others. We always knew that. At 13, after a poorly treated flu, he had another relapse. It came suddenly. Fever, exhaustion, dizziness. Hospital visits became frequent again, and with them the fear. I had no money. I had debts at the pharmacy, rent arrears, and lost 2 jobs because I accompanied him. One morning, the landlady threw us out just like that. She said she couldn't wait any longer. I didn't argue, didn't beg. I packed our things in black garbage bags and we went out on the street. That night we slept in a women's shelter. They let us stay because we were a special case, the only ones with a teenage boy. The looks were pitying but distant. They knew our stay would be short, and it was. After a week, a volunteer helped us find a small room in a shack with a shared bathroom and cardboard walls. I was 40. I scrubbed floors, cooked for 4 households, walked with swollen feet from place to place. My back couldn't take it anymore, but I kept going because every cent was for medications, transportation, or his school visits. Elias insisted on learning, even when he was weak, even when he sometimes missed school. He read in bed, wrote down everything he missed. He never missed an exam. School was his and our refuge. The teachers knew our situation. Many helped quietly, lent him books, invited him to projects that opened doors for him. One teacher arranged a meeting for him with mentors from the tech industry. He had begun learning to program on an old computer he had rescued from the trash. I didn't understand how he did it. I only saw him sit for hours in front of the screen, writing codes that were puzzles to me. At 15, he developed his first app, a system for school medical records. He presented it at a city competition and won first prize, a new computer, and a small cash prize. That night he didn't cry because of the computer, but because he said he could finally give me something back. I said he owed me nothing. His existence was already my gift, but he hugged me as if the prize were also mine. And it was. We lived with the bare minimum. The room was damp, without ventilation. He studied with an old fan that barely worked. When it rained, we put buckets out to catch the water. But we didn't complain. We had gotten used to surviving without outside help. We only accepted charity when there was no other option. Dignity remained our shield. Sometimes people asked about his mother. I said she was far away. I wasn't lying, I was shortening the story. Elias never asked. But one day, at 16, he looked at me while I was cooking and said he knew. I asked what he knew. He replied that he knew his mother didn't want to raise him, that she wasn't dead or far away, but simply didn't want to. I looked at him silently. I expected resentment, but there was none, only acceptance. I said I was sorry. He replied that there was nothing to regret. He had everything he needed. I had given him everything, and one day he would give it back to me. In that moment, I knew I had done it right. Not because I expected him to take care of me, but because I had raised an honest, noble, conscious man without poison in his soul, one who didn't let abandonment break him, who didn't continue the chain of hatred, who didn't use his wound as an excuse. He chose to be free, and I felt less old at his side because his strength rejuvenated me, because his growth, his progress, his victories made me forget the nights at the train station, the collapsing roofs, the empty plates. The change didn't come suddenly, but it felt like it did. Sometimes life wallows in the mud for years until someone, without warning, extends a clean hand. That's how it was with Elias. I noticed it in his walk, in the fact that he no longer lowered his gaze, in the confidence with which he spoke with adults, entrepreneurs, project managers who suddenly sought him out, as if they had all recognized his worth at the same time, the worth I had always known. At 17, a group of young entrepreneurs invited him to participate in a technology incubator. They wanted to foster his talent, turn his ideas into sellable products. They promised no immediate money, but training, workspace, and contacts that could change his life. At first he hesitated, asked if I could manage without him in the afternoons. I said now it was his turn to decide. He joined the group as the youngest member. The others were twice his age, but when he spoke, they listened. He explained his ideas clearly, without arrogance, with modesty. He told me about every advance with restrained enthusiasm. I listened to him, hands in my lap at our old wooden table, like someone witnessing a miracle without fanfare. The first months he didn't bring money home, but news. We talked with a software company. They want to adapt my program for a clinic network. They want to patent my idea. I barely understood the terms, but the joy in his eyes was enough for me. He came home later, sometimes didn't eat with me. It hurt a little, but I said nothing. I set his food out for him, covered it. I never blamed him. I knew he was building something bigger than our routines. When he brought money home for the first time, he laid it silently on the table. He had earned it with a project that automated clinic processes. He looked at me as if he needed my permission to touch it. I said I was proud. With the money, he bought a used refrigerator and took me to the eye doctor. He bought me the glasses I had needed for years, not out of vanity, out of necessity. I could barely remember when I had last clearly seen a street sign. Thanks to him, I could see sharply again. He began talking about things I only knew from the news. Investments, servers, licenses, travel. They offered him the chance to present his idea in another city. He didn't want to leave me alone, said it again and again. I said he had to go. If I had protected him for years, I now had to protect his freedom. He flew for the first time. When he came back, he had a different expression. He had met people who believed in him. They offered him partnerships to build something of his own. At 18, he founded his first company. We didn't celebrate with fanfare, but with coffee and homemade bread at our old table. He said the company name was in English, but the initials stood for Elias and Esperanza. Hope. It didn't touch me because of the gesture, but because of its meaning. He hadn't forgotten where he came from. Things began to change. He earned real money, not much at first, but enough to leave the damp room. He rented a small apartment, 2 rooms, clean, with its own bathroom, a working kitchen, and a window to the sky. The first nights I could barely sleep, not from discomfort, but because I couldn't believe we had it, our own home. He continued to grow. The meetings multiplied, the trips too. I stayed home, knitted, cooked, walked carefully. Sometimes he took me to events where he was honored. I sat among suit wearers who greeted me respectfully without knowing who I was. But he knew. In every speech he mentioned me. He said if he had achieved anything, it was because his grandmother had held him when the world turned its back on him. People began to know me as Elias's grandmother. They offered me comfortable chairs, warm drinks, transportation, but I remained the same, with the same patched shoes, the same cloth bag, not out of pride, out of habit. The riches that came didn't change me. It was his success. Even though he offered me everything, I only asked for one thing, that he never forget who he is. And he never did. At 20, he sold his first app for a sum I couldn't pronounce. He said it quietly, as if he feared it could separate us. I asked if he was happy. He said yes. I believed him. Then I said the rest didn't matter. With the money, he bought a house. Not a castle, a simple, cozy house with a garden, a large kitchen, and a room for me with a window through which the afternoon sun fell. There a new chapter began. He took me for comprehensive health checkups, renewed my clothes, set up a television I couldn't operate at first, bought me books, a new radio, an armchair with good lighting for reading. He treated me like a queen, but without unnecessary pomp, only with care, respect, attention. That was worth more than all the gold in the world. He never stopped working, never became arrogant, ate with me at least once a day. He called when he was late, wrote when he traveled, sent photos. He never left me behind, never hid me, never used me as an anecdote. He made me part of his story, and that was more valuable to me than any title. I was over 70. My hands trembled, my legs failed. But my heart was calm because I knew my effort hadn't been in vain. The love I gave him despite hunger, loneliness, and exhaustion had taken root. He was what he was, not only because of his talent, but because from the beginning someone believed in him, because someone refused to give up on him. That was me. At 21, his company was recognized in the tech sector. He had offices, employees, international clients. I understood nothing about software or business, but I saw what mattered. His responsibility, his ethics, how he treated his team with respect, without arrogance. He was young, but no one underestimated him. He spoke little, listened a lot, and never forgot where he came from. He didn't wear expensive watches, didn't drive luxury cars, dressed simply, held on to old habits. That reassured me. I knew success hadn't corrupted him. One morning he asked me to accompany him to see something. We drove with his driver, but he helped me get in and out as always, as if I were a fragile queen. He took me to the outskirts of the city. There, surrounded by trees, with a high iron gate, stood a large white house with 2 floors, a front garden, and a wooden bench under a linden tree. He said it was our new home. I didn't know what to say. I looked at it, couldn't grasp it. I, who had lived between leaky roofs, now had a house with superfluous rooms, a large kitchen, a library, a light-flooded living room. He took my arm and showed me every corner. He said he had designed it for me, to give me a place of peace. There was a room transformed into a sewing studio because he knew I had always liked to sew. A library with books he had collected for me, an armchair for my back, a garden with herbs and flowers I had shown him as a child. The first days I didn't know what to do with myself. It felt like I was walking through a stranger's house. I cooked as always, even though I had a luxury kitchen. I slept with my old patched blanket. Elias watched me silently, never pressured me to change. He let me arrive with patience, because he knew it wasn't about money, but about history. I came from a world where stale bread and tap water were delicacies. Soon caregivers came. He insisted on professional help for my checkups, medications, routines. One came in the morning, one in the evening. At first I was embarrassed, but I understood it was his way of protecting me, not showing off. I learned to accept it, as I had accepted his childhood gifts, with humility, with love. He gave me a modern phone, showed me how it worked. He wrote me messages when he left. Arrive safely. In a meeting. See you at dinner. I learned to respond with emojis and short sentences. We laughed about it. He took photos with me in the garden, showed them to his friends. He never hid me, made me part of his life. I remained his foundation. The media began reporting about him, at conferences, at award ceremonies. Sometimes they called me to talk about the woman who had raised him. I always declined. I didn't want fame. I didn't want to sell my story as a victim narrative. I wanted him to be free to shine without carrying my name. I had done enough. Now it was his turn. Nevertheless, in his office hung a black and white photo of us, where he was 6, and I was holding him with an old scarf on a park bench. When someone asked what motivated him, he pointed to that picture. He didn't say much, just that, and it was enough. I saw him donate to hospitals, support children from poor backgrounds, help single mothers. He didn't do it for publicity, but because he knew what it was like to have nothing. As he once said, whoever forgets the cold doesn't know how to give warmth. I cooked as always, even though he had employees who could have prepared feasts. He ate my stew as if it were a luxury dish, and said he couldn't find that taste in any restaurant. We had quiet years without upheavals. My health stabilized. I walked in the garden, watered the plants, knitted blankets that we gave away. We had routines. Breakfast at 8, my nap at 3, his visits in the afternoon, dinner together when he could. I never felt alone, never like a burden. That was an invaluable gift. We lived surrounded by things we once dreamed of. Books, time, silence, fresh bread, a house where it didn't rain inside. We needed nothing more. Sometimes I sat in the evening with a cup of tea on the porch, watched him read reports on his laptop, and thought we had made it. Against all odds, against all logic, 2 people who came from abandonment, hunger, and fear were now simply there. But life never closes its circles without one last turn. Why doesn't everything past dissolve? Some things return, not always as you expect. We lived in harmony. It was a Thursday morning when a visit came that I never expected. Sometimes it still surprised me to open my eyes in the morning. I could hardly believe that this warm room with linen curtains and a bed without squeaking springs belonged to me. That the garden full of flowers that reminded me of my childhood was right outside my window. I got up slowly, stretched my feet before setting them on the floor, felt the soft carpet that Elias had made so the cold wouldn't creep into my legs. Small gestures, true care. Sometimes, when I looked around, it felt like I was living in another woman's house, one who had never been in public hospitals, never stood in soup kitchens, never slept on mattresses on the floor, never sold her wedding ring for a bottle of cough syrup. But then Elias appeared in the doorway with a steaming cup of coffee and his quiet smile, and I remembered. No, this was my life. Every corner of this house, every improvement, every comfort, was the result of something we had planted in the poorest soil. The garden became my place. I spent hours among the plants. I had roses again, touched the earth with my hands, watered with the old watering can that Elias had bought at an antique market, because it reminded him of the one from our old house. I planted basil, lavender, thyme. I felt useful again. The house was big, yes, but I wasn't a woman who sat with her hands folded. I cooked my stews, baked bread. Housekeepers came twice a week, but I washed my own cup, mended my own tablecloths, not out of necessity, out of choice. I didn't want to forget who I was. Elias grew as an entrepreneur. It was no longer just about technology. He invested in health, education, sustainable development. But when he came through that door, he was just my grandson. He sat at the kitchen table, took off his shoes, asked for tea, and we talked about our things. He told me about his progress. I told him about my tomatoes. We laughed. There was peace. Sometimes he brought guests. Important people, they said. Entrepreneurs, investors, academics. He always introduced me with the same words. She saved my life, literally. He never left me in the background. He never treated me like decoration. He asked me for advice, even if it wasn't about business. He wanted my opinion about people. He said my intuition was better than any resume. I said he was exaggerating. He insisted it wasn't so. At 26, he founded a small foundation in my name. He asked for my permission first. He said it was for children who, like him, were born without chances. He did it modestly, without press, without flashlights. He gave scholarships, equipped schools, financed surgeries. I didn't go to the events. I stayed home, baked a cake for his return. But he brought photos, told stories, made me part of it, never excluded me. One afternoon, while I was embroidering his initials on a napkin, I thought that perhaps my life was like this thread, invisible, but holding something from one point to another, silent, firm, without anyone noticing, but there, always there. I felt peace. I no longer had nightmares about hospitals. I no longer woke with a start when the phone rang at night. My knees no longer hurt when climbing stairs, because the house had a small elevator he had installed for me. Every corner spoke of care. Everything I once lacked I now had in abundance, but it didn't overwhelm me. It didn't make me arrogant but grateful. I didn't think about Clara. Not because I hated her, but because she no longer had a place in my thoughts. She was a distant figure like a closed door I never looked at again. What she had done couldn't be undone, and I had decided not to carry that burden. I didn't want to speak badly of her, didn't want to poison Elias. He never pressed to learn more. He knew enough without details. We had created something beautiful from pain. A family of two, born out of necessity, strengthened through respect and deep love. We lacked nothing. We demanded nothing. We simply lived. But life always finds a way to test us. The day Clara returned was as if the past had knocked on the door, with the same cold fingers with which it had left us. She came with an expression I didn't recognize. A mixture of guilt, surprise, and a pride she hadn't yet shed. She didn't come hungry, not asking for forgiveness. She came with the idea that she could impose herself again, as if the years hadn't passed, as if everything we had built had no weight compared to her return. Then I understood that a scar, even when it heals, is not always forgotten. The morning Clara came back was clear, cloudless, without omens. I was sitting by the window, drinking tea and embroidering a case for my glasses when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. Elias was on a business trip abroad, had organized caregivers for me and called regularly. No one had announced themselves. The young woman who cleaned said a woman with a suitcase was standing at the entrance and claimed to belong to the family. I found that strange. I had no family except Elias. I stood up slowly, without haste, with the calm that comes only after weathered storms. I walked the long hallway, through the inner courtyard to the front door. When it opened, I froze. It was Clara. 30 years had passed since our last meeting. She had aged, but her haughty eyes were the same. She wore expensive but ill-fitting clothes, dyed hair, painted lips, and an expression I couldn't interpret. She looked at me with astonishment, almost with contempt, as if she couldn't believe that I, the abandoned mother, was still alive. Then she saw the house behind me, the white columns, the large windows, the marble floor. Her surprise was immediately visible. Her facial expression changed from judgment to confusion. Her lips opened, but she found no words. I let her speak. I just stood there, upright like a pillar that defies the wind. She said she had come back to look for me, had learned my address from an old neighbor. Didn't know if I was well, if I was even alive. She spoke with a false voice, disguised as concern. She asked how I was doing, how my life had been, what had happened to her son. Then she named him. She asked about Elias, and her tone changed. It was no longer the voice of a daughter looking for her mother, but that of a woman making sure her decision back then hadn't left too embarrassing a trace. She spoke of him as if she knew nothing, asked if he was alive, if he had survived. I only nodded. Then she pointed at the house with a mixture of disbelief and nervousness, and asked if Elias lived here. I said yes, it was his house. Everything she saw was the work of her son. I lived here because he wanted it that way. I explained that he was an upright man, raised without her, but with love, education, respect. That I had raised him alone, healed him, fed him, held his hand when no one else did. Clara swallowed. I saw her face crumble. She hadn't expected this. In her imagination, I was probably still the poor, sick old woman she had left behind. Elias would perhaps be a gray, lonely, bitter man. She had come to salvage something, but she found a world that no longer needed her. She tried to justify herself. She said her partner at the time had forbidden her to raise a sick child. She had been forced to leave. She had no choice. She had suffered internally, thought about us every day. I listened without blinking, said nothing. There was no point in arguing with the past. She spoke as if she wanted to rewrite history, as if a sentence was enough to erase 3 decades of absence. She asked if she could see Elias. She had to talk to him, explain to him. She understood everything now. I asked her to wait. I called Elias, told him without drama that his mother was here. He listened silently, asked me not to let her in, said he would come back that same evening. I shouldn't worry. He would take care of it. I went back to the door. Clara was still standing there, like a ghost without a place. She asked if she could come in. I said no, this was no longer her space. Everything she had destroyed, I had rebuilt. She couldn't just come back as if nothing had happened. The years couldn't be undone with late tears, she pleaded. For the first time in a long time, I saw her without pride, but also without love. I saw her empty. That night when Elias came back, he entered through the back door, hugged me, asked if I was okay. I said yes. He seemed different, serious but composed. He went to the front door. Clara was still waiting. He opened, looked at her, didn't hug her, didn't call her mom, but her name. Just that. She tried to come closer. He stepped back. He said he recognized the truth. For years he had believed she might have been forced to leave. Something had stopped her. She might have been afraid. But after investigations, he knew she had left of her own free will, that she didn't want to raise a sick child, that she had chosen freedom over him, that she left him because he was too heavy for her. Clara wanted to say something. Elias raised his hand. He said it wasn't necessary. He didn't need explanations. It no longer mattered. He was an adult, healed, had achieved what he had without her help, and now there was no place for her anymore, not out of resentment, out of self-protection. He said he didn't hate her, but he didn't need her. Then he closed the door, not angrily, but decisively. I saw him come back. He hugged me tightly, asked if I wanted to say something. I said no. I had stopped expecting words from Clara years ago. Now only he mattered. I had him, and that was enough for me. The house became quiet again, as it should be. 3 days later, Clara appeared again. She didn't call, didn't announce herself, stood with the same suitcase at the gate, with a less haughty expression. Tired, perhaps, defeated. She rang the bell and asked to speak with me. Not with Elias, with me. I went into the garden slowly to the bench under the linden tree. I nodded for her to approach. I didn't invite her inside. We sat in the shade silently. She spoke first. This time she brought no excuses, but softer words, yet with the same root. She said she had been afraid, felt alone. Raising a sick child had been too much for her. No one had prepared her for it. Her partner at the time had offered her a way out, and she had taken it. She said she had felt free for a while, believed she had done the right thing, regretted it later, but didn't know how to come back. She thought I would be angry. Elias would hate her, and over the years, this fear became a wall. I listened, didn't interrupt. I wanted her to get it all out. When she finished, she looked at me, asked if I thought Elias could ever forgive her. I said I didn't know. She would have to ask him. But I warned her. Elias wasn't a child looking for love. He was a man who had grown without her, whose decisions weren't shaped by the desire for reconciliation with an absent mother. He had learned to live with the truth. And whoever gets used to the truth no longer accepts lies. She tried to cry, but the tears didn't come, not because she didn't want to, but because it was perhaps too late to feel. She asked if I hated her. I said no. Hatred is a form of connection, and I was no longer connected to her. She went to the door, asked again to see Elias. This time he agreed. He came into the garden, sat beside me, looked at her. He was calm, without resentment, just firm. She repeated that she had no choice, had been a victim of circumstances, young, overwhelmed. He let her talk. Then he took a deep breath and answered with something she didn't expect. He said he had thought for years she had been forced, perhaps by a manipulative man. Perhaps she had been mistaken but hadn't found her way back. He had even wanted to believe she was dead, so he wouldn't have to live with the idea of her indifference. But over time he found the truth. Not through words, through actions. She had never asked about him, never tried to find out anything, had been absent when he needed her most. Now, after everything, he didn't hate her. He just no longer needed her. He said he wasn't looking for a mother. He had someone who loved him, who picked him up when he fell. Me. I didn't give birth to him, but held him when no one else did. What did he owe life? And what did he owe her? He owed her nothing. Clara didn't know what to say. She lowered her gaze. Her shoulders sank. She asked if she could see him again. Elias said no, that door was closed, not as punishment, but to protect himself. He had found his peace and wouldn't risk it for someone else's regret. Then he stood up, looked at me, said he was going back to work, kissed my forehead and left. I stayed sitting with Clara for a few more minutes. She said nothing. Neither did I. Finally, I said she wasn't welcome here. This house was built with years of love, effort, and dedication. There was no place here for someone who only knew how to leave. My life was full, not with things, with meaning. I didn't need anyone's apology to know I had done the right thing. Clara stood up, took her suitcase, and walked to the exit without looking back. She didn't ring again, left no letters, sent no messages. I knew this chapter was definitively closed, not with anger, with truth. After that day, Clara didn't come back, didn't call, didn't write, didn't ask anymore. Her final absence didn't surprise me. Deep inside, I always knew she had no roots, that her way of being in the world meant passing through it without staying. I understood it late, after she had torn out a part of my soul that I later put back together with courage, patience, and love. I didn't hate her. It wasn't necessary. When you've been so close to real pain, to the trembling of a feverish child on a stretcher, to the choice between medications or food, resentment finds no place. Hatred needs energy, and for years I had only the strength to live one more day. Elias never mentioned her again, neither did I. Not out of cowardice, out of respect. We had closed that door with clear words, and there was no reason to open it again. Our bond didn't need shadows. It was bright, pure, built with everything Clara wasn't willing to give. I watched him continue to grow, not in size or age, but in being. His company expanded. He opened new locations, won prizes, but he remained the same. He brought me flowers from the market when he traveled. Cooked Sunday pancakes even when they burned. Read me letters from children who were supported through his foundation. He hugged me silently, without having to say how much he loved me. I knew it, I felt it. My days became slower. I slept more, walked less. But he didn't leave me alone. He adapted the house for me, replaced steps with ramps, hired a permanent caregiver who spoke gently to me. They treated me like a treasure they didn't want to lose, not out of weakness, out of gratitude. One afternoon, sitting on the porch, I asked him if he had ever forgiven me for not being his real mother. He set his book aside, looked at me, and said I had been more of a mother than anyone. Being a mother doesn't mean giving birth, but staying when everyone leaves, sacrificing when necessary, never letting go of the hand even when it hurts. He said it without pathos, as if it were obvious. Then he stroked my head as he had done as a child. It was the only time in years I cried in front of him. Sometimes I think about everything we didn't have. Birthdays without cake, nights without a roof, illnesses without means, questions without answers. But I also think about what we had. Shared bread, repeated stories, warm soup, a pressed hand, respected silence, a look that's enough. In the end, we won. The neighbors in this neighborhood knew us. They said we were like a story from a book, but no one really knew what it had cost. Only us. Only my body knows what it was like to carry him sick to the hospital. Only his eyes remember how I stayed awake to monitor his breathing. Some things you don't tell. You live them, carry them inside you. I never sought recognition. I just wanted Elias to live, and he lived. More than that, he flourished. That was everything to me. I didn't need medals, honors, just to see that my grandson, whom his mother didn't want, was now a man who carried not wounds, but lessons. That's how old age came with dignity. I lacked nothing, neither warmth, nor bread, nor tenderness. I stood up with help, yes, but I could still smell the jasmine in the garden, sit under the linden tree with my blanket, give thanks. That was my victory. Not to be bitter, not to have passed on hatred, only love. And if Elias has children one day, I know he will never abandon them, because he learned that the most valuable thing is not what's inherited in blood, but what you give through presence, what you sow without expecting fruit. Perhaps he'll tell them about me. Perhaps not. It doesn't matter, because what he is already carries my mark. Life took a lot from me, but it gave me him, and that was enough. I felt less old at his side. After that day, Clara didn't return, didn't call, didn't write, didn't ask anymore. Her final absence didn't surprise me. Deep inside, I always knew she had no roots, that her way of being in the world meant passing through it without staying. I understood it late, after she had torn out a part of my soul that I later put back together with courage, patience, and love. I didn't hate her. It wasn't necessary. When you've been so close to real pain, to the trembling of a feverish child on a stretcher, to the choice between medications or food, resentment finds no place. Hatred needs energy, and for years I had only the strength to live one more day. Elias never mentioned her again, neither did I. Not out of cowardice, out of respect. We had closed that door with clear words, and there was no reason to open it again. Our bond didn't need shadows. It was bright, pure, built with everything Clara wasn't willing to give. I watched him continue to grow, not in size or age, but in being. His company expanded. He opened new locations, won prizes, but he remained the same. He brought me flowers from the market when he traveled. Cooked Sunday pancakes even when they burned. Read me letters from children who were supported through his foundation. He hugged me silently, without having to say how much he loved me. I knew it, I felt it. My days became slower. I slept more, walked less, but he didn't leave me alone. He adapted the house for me, replaced steps with ramps, hired a permanent caregiver who spoke gently to me. They treated me like a treasure they didn't want to lose, not out of weakness, out of gratitude. One afternoon, sitting on the porch, I asked him if he had ever forgiven me for not being his real mother. He set his book aside, looked at me, and said I had been more of a mother than anyone. Being a mother doesn't mean giving birth, but staying when everyone leaves, sacrificing when necessary, never letting go of the hand even when it hurts. He said it without pathos, as if it were obvious. Then he stroked my head as he had done as a child. It was the only time in years I cried in front of him. Sometimes I think about everything we didn't have. Birthdays without cake, nights without a roof, illnesses without means, questions without answers. But I also think about what we had. Shared bread, repeated stories, warm soup, a pressed hand, respected silence, a look that's enough. In the end, we won. The neighbors in this neighborhood knew us. They said we were like a story from a book, but no one really knew what it had cost. Only us. Only my body knows what it was like to carry him sick to the hospital. Only his eyes remember how I stayed awake to monitor his breathing. Some things you don't tell. You live them, carry them inside you. I never sought recognition. I just wanted Elias to live, and he lived. More than that, he flourished. That was everything to me. I didn't need medals, honors, just to see that my grandson, whom his mother didn't want, was now a man who carried not wounds, but lessons. That's how old age came with dignity. I lacked nothing, neither warmth, nor bread, nor tenderness. I stood up with help, yes, but I could still smell the jasmine in the garden, sit under the linden tree with my blanket, give thanks. That was my victory. Not to be bitter, not to have passed on hatred, only love. And if Elias has children one day, I know he will never abandon them, because he learned that the most valuable thing is not what's inherited in blood, but what you give through presence, what you sow without expecting fruit. Perhaps he'll tell them about me. Perhaps not. It doesn't matter, because what he is already carries my mark. Life took a lot from me, but it gave me him, and that was enough. If you liked my story, you can encourage me to write more stories by sending me a donation. I thank you infinitely, and you, what would you do in this person's place? I would love to hear your opinion, so please share it with me in the comments. I'm always curious about what you all think, and also write me where you heard this story. For more life stories like this, like the video and subscribe to my channel. There are many other stories waiting for you. With heartfelt greetings, until next time, M.